I always thought that blood meant something. That family was the one constant in a world full of variables. Turns out, I was just another asset in my father's portfolio, one he was willing to liquidate the moment it became convenient. When I tell people about what happened, they usually respond with disbelief. But he's your father, they say, as if that biological fact should somehow negate the last 28 years of calculated manipulation. The truth is, some of the most profound betrayals don't come from enemies, they come from the people who were supposed to protect you. Growing up as the only daughter of Richard Coleman, I lived what many would consider the American dream. Our house in Westchester County was the kind that appeared in architectural magazines. My father built his wealth through a commercial real estate empire that spanned 3 states. My mother, Caroline, was the perfect corporate wife, always impeccably dressed, hosting dinner parties where business deals were sealed over wine that cost more than most people's monthly groceries. From the outside, we were a portrait of success. I went to an elite private school, spent summers in Martha's Vineyard, and had the kind of college fund that most families could only dream about. But inside our perfectly manicured world, there was always an undercurrent of expectation. Achievement wasn't celebrated, it was required. Mediocrity is for other people's children, Olivia, my father would say whenever I brought home anything less than an A+. Even when I made valedictorian, his only comment was, "That's what we expected." My older brother, Marcus, had always been my father's clear favorite. Where I was artistic and drawn to literature, Marcus was all business, a carbon copy of our father. He majored in finance at Wharton, came home to work for the family business, and quickly became my father's right hand. They spoke the same language, shared the same priorities. I was always on the outside of that relationship, desperately trying to find my way in. Still, I tried to carve my own path. After college, instead of joining Coleman Enterprises as expected, I pursued my passion for art history, earning a PhD and eventually landing a curator position at a prestigious museum in New York. My salary was a fraction of what I could have made working for my father, but for the first time, I felt like I was building something that belonged to me alone, and why father never really understood my career choice. At family gatherings, he would introduce me with, "This is Olivia, she works at a museum," his tone suggesting I had chosen to collect garbage for a living. But I had made peace with his disappointment, or at least I thought I had. Everything changed 3 months ago, when my mother was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was grim from the start, 6 months at best. What followed was a whirlwind of specialists, experimental treatments, and watching my once vibrant mother shrink into a hollow version of herself. During those early weeks, my father was surprisingly present. He arranged for the best oncologists, set up a hospital bed in their bedroom, hired round-the-clock nurses. I took a leave of absence from the museum to help with her care. Marcus flew in from business trips whenever he could, but the day-to-day burden fell largely on me. One night, after a particularly rough day of my mother's treatment, I found my father alone in his study, staring at the family portrait taken on their 30th wedding anniversary. "She's fighting so hard," I said, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't look up. Caroline never knew how to give up. It's what I loved about her. The past tense wasn't lost on me. He was already mourning her. "The doctors mentioned a clinical trial in Houston," I ventured. "It's experimental, but I've already looked into it," he cut me off. "The success rates are minimal. It would just prolong her suffering." I felt a surge of anger. Shouldn't that be her choice? Shouldn't we at least tell her about all the options? My father finally turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is protect the people we love from false hope. I wanted to argue, but the exhaustion of the past weeks washed over me. Besides, my father had always been the pragmatist, the one who made the hard decisions. If he said the treatment wasn't worth pursuing, he had probably analyzed it from every angle. As my mother's condition deteriorated, so did my father's veneer of stoicism. He began spending more time at the office, leaving me to sit with her through the increasingly frequent episodes of pain. When he was home, he was distant, retreating to his study with a glass of scotch. I told myself he was grieving in his own way, that men of his generation weren't equipped to face mortality so directly. It was during one of those long nights by my mother's bedside that she first mentioned the trust. "Your father set it up years ago," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "For both you and Marcus. Equal shares." I held her frail hand. "Mom, we don't need to talk about money right now." She squeezed my fingers with surprising strength. "Listen to me, Olivia. The trust is ironclad. Richard can't touch it, no matter what happens after I'm gone." The intensity in her eyes unsettled me. "Why would that matter?" "Dad would never." "You don't know everything about your father," she interrupted, a hint of her old authority returning. "Promise me you'll get a copy of the trust documents. Don't just take his word for anything." Before I could press her for more details, she drifted off to sleep, the morphine finally taking effect. I sat there for hours, turning her words over in my mind. What was she trying to tell me? What didn't I know about my father? The next morning, I casually asked him about the trust over breakfast. "Mom mentioned something about trusts last night," I said, watching his reaction carefully. She seemed concerned. My father's expression didn't change, but he set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "The pain medication is making her confused. Everything is in order, you don't need to worry about financial matters." "I'm not worried," I said. "I'd just like to understand what's in place." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Now isn't the time, Olivia. Your mother needs you focused on her care, not distracted by legal documents you wouldn't understand anyway." The dismissal stung, but it was nothing new. My father had always treated me like I was somehow less capable than Marcus, despite my academic achievements. "I have a PhD, Dad. I think I can handle reading a trust document," I replied, unable to keep the edge from my voice. He stood up, effectively ending the conversation. "I have a meeting. The day nurse should be here by 9. After he left, I sat in the kitchen, that familiar feeling of inadequacy washing over me. But this time, it was accompanied by something new: suspicion. Why was he so reluctant to discuss the trust? And why had my mother been so insistent that I look into it? Over the next week, I tried to broach the subject with my father several more times, but he always deflected. Meanwhile, my mother's lucid moments became increasingly rare. When Marcus flew in for the weekend, I pulled him aside after dinner. "Has Dad ever talked to you about the family trusts?" I asked as we stood on the back patio. Marcus took a long pull from his beer. "Sure, years ago. Basic stuff: assets are divided equally between us after both of them are gone." "Why?" Mom seemed worried about it. "She specifically told me to get a copy of the documents." My brother's expression softened. "Lev, she's heavily medicated. Dad's got everything handled, like he always does." "That's what he said too," I replied. "But it wouldn't hurt to see the actual documents, right?" Marcus sighed. "Look, I know you're stressed. We all are. But starting drama over paperwork isn't going to help Mom right now." I bit back a retort. Of course Marcus would take Dad's side. He always did. "I'm not trying to start drama," I said evenly. "I'm trying to honor a request from our dying mother." Marcus flinched at my bluntness. "Fine. I'll talk to Dad about getting copies for both of us, okay? Will that make you feel better?" I nodded, though I knew it was just a placating gesture. Marcus would mention it to our father, who would make some excuse, and nothing would change. It was a dynamic I'd been navigating my entire life, but something had shifted inside me. My mother's urgent warning had awakened a doubt I couldn't shake. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I slipped into my father's study. I told myself I was just looking for the trust documents, but deep down, I knew I was crossing a line I'd never dared to cross before. The study was meticulously organized, like everything else in my father's life. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with precise categories. I started with family documents, then moved to legal, but found nothing related to trusts. Just as I was about to give up, I noticed a small safe built into the bookshelf, partially hidden behind a row of leather-bound classics. My heart raced as I stared at the electronic keypad. What would my father use as a code? His birthday? Too obvious. The founding date of his company? Possibly. On a hunch, I tried my mother's birthday. Nothing. Then Marcus's. Still nothing. Against my better judgment, I typed in my own birth date. The safe clicked open. Inside were several folders, each labeled in my father's precise handwriting. One read Caroline Medical, another Coleman Enterprises, Succession. But it was the third folder that made my blood run cold, Trust Revision, 2024. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and began to read. The legal language was dense, but the core changes were clear enough. The original trust had indeed specified an equal division of assets between Marcus and me. But the revision, dated just 2 months ago, after my mother's diagnosis, fundamentally altered the terms. Under the new arrangement, the bulk of the estate would still go to Marcus. My share, however, had been drastically reduced to a token amount, essentially cutting me out of my inheritance. The document cited my financial irresponsibility and lifestyle choices inconsistent with family values as justifications. Sat on the floor of my father's study, the papers scattered around me, trying to process what I was seeing. Financial irresponsibility? I had always lived within my means, even on a museum curator's salary. And what lifestyle choices was he referring to? Because I hadn't followed his prescribed path into the family business, as I continued reading, another document caught my eye, a printed email chain between my father and their estate attorney, dated just days after my mother's diagnosis. Jim, need to make these changes ASAP before Caroline's condition worsens. She won't agree to the revisions, so timing is critical. Must be finalized while I still have power of attorney. Power of attorney. The words exploded in my brain like a bomb. My father had deliberately waited until my mother was too sick to object, then used his legal authority to cut me out of what she had intended for me. Heard a noise in the hallway and hastily gathered the documents, shoving them back into the folder. But instead of returning them to the safe, I made a split-second decision. I tucked the folder under my sweater and quietly closed the safe. Back in my childhood bedroom, I took photos of every page with trembling hands, then crept back to replace the folder exactly as I'd found it. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay awake, replaying every interaction with my father through this new, devastating lens. The next morning, dark circles under my eyes, I drove to a local copy shop and printed everything. Then I called the only person I knew who might be able to help me make sense of this betrayal, my college roommate Diane, now a partner at a law firm specializing in estate litigation. He can't do this, Diane said after reviewing the documents over video chat. The original trust was irrevocable, specifically to prevent this kind of modification. And using power of attorney this way, it's beyond unethical, it's potentially criminal. What should I do? I asked, my voice small. Diane's expression was grim. First, you need to secure a copy of the original trust. Then we need to challenge the revision before any assets are distributed. My mother is dying, Diane. I can't start a legal battle right now. I understand that, Liv. But your father has shown his hand. He's not going to play fair, and once your mother is gone. She let the implications hang in the air. I ended the call with a promise to think about my options, but in reality, I already knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about money, it was about my mother's wishes being deliberately subverted, about my father's breathtaking betrayal of both of us. That evening, Marcus returned to Boston, promising to be back the following weekend. My father retreated to his office for a conference call. I sat with my mother, who was having one of her more lucid days. I found the trust documents, I said quietly, watching her face. The revised ones. Her eyes, sunken but still sharp, met mine. He did it, didn't he? I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. A single tear slid down her hollow cheek. I'm so sorry, Olivia. I tried to protect you. Why? I finally managed. Why would he do this? My mother closed her eyes briefly. Your father, he's always seen the world in terms of loyalty. Marcus followed his path, worked in his business. You chose your own way. So this is punishment for not becoming his clone? It's more complicated than that, she sighed. Richard believes family wealth should grow the family business. Your career choice, it's never been about money for you. He sees that as a weakness. It's my inheritance, I said, anger finally breaking through the shock. It was supposed to be for both of us. It still will be, my mother said with sudden fierceness. Richard thinks he's so clever, but I've known him for 40 years. I knew he might try something like this. She gestured weakly toward her bedside table. Bottom drawer. There's a key taped under the liner. Confused, I found the small key exactly where she described. Safe deposit box at First National, she continued. Box 247. Go tomorrow. What's in it? A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. Insurance. Against exactly this scenario. Before I could ask more questions, she drifted off again, the brief surge of energy depleted. I clutched the key, wondering what kind of insurance my pragmatic mother could have possibly arranged. The next day, I made an excuse about needing to pick up some of my mother's prescription refills. My father barely looked up from his laptop, just nodded and returned to whatever spreadsheet had captured his attention. At the bank, I presented my ID and the key. The manager led me to a private room where I could examine the contents of box 247. Inside, I found a sealed envelope with my name on it, a USB drive, and a bound legal document. The document was a secondary trust, established by my mother using her own inherited assets. Assets my father apparently didn't know existed or couldn't touch. She had created it 5 years ago, with me as the sole beneficiary. The accompanying letter explained everything. Dearest Olivia, if you're reading this, then your father has done exactly what I feared he might. I've watched him gradually withdraw his approval as you've built your own life separate from his vision. While I've always been proud of your independence, I recognized the growing rift between you. What your father never knew is that my grandmother left me a substantial portfolio of investments, separate from the Coleman family assets. I've managed these investments quietly for decades, and they've grown considerably. This trust contains those assets, designated solely for you. The USB drive contains documentation of all transactions, plus recordings of several conversations with your father where he explicitly agreed that our children would inherit equally. Should you need to challenge any changes he's made, this evidence will support your case. I've always admired your determination to forge your own path. Now, I'm providing you the means to continue that journey without being punished for your courage. All my love, Mom. I sat in that sterile bank room, clutching my mother's letter, overwhelmed by both grief and gratitude. Even in her final days, she had been protecting me, preparing for a betrayal she had seen coming long before I had. The USB drive contained exactly what she promised, financial records and, most damning of all, audio recordings of my father explicitly agreeing that Marcus and I would inherit equally. The children get equal shares, Caroline. I've always been clear about that, his voice declared in one recording from just last year. Armed with this evidence, I returned home with a new resolve. I wouldn't confront my father, not yet. My mother still needed me, and creating open warfare while she was suffering would only add to her burden. But I would be prepared for what came after. Over the next 2 weeks, my mother declined rapidly. The cancer was aggressive, just as the doctors had warned. During her final days, I rarely left her side. My father moved between detached deficiency and stunned silence. Marcus flew in again, bringing his wife and children to say goodbye. The night before she died, my mother had a brief moment of clarity. She squeezed my hand weakly. Remember what I told you, she whispered. You're stronger than you know. She passed away peacefully the next morning, with all of us gathered around her bed. In the haze of grief that followed, arrangements were made, condolences received. The funeral was exactly what she would have wanted, elegant but not ostentatious, filled with the spring flowers she had always loved. 3 days after the funeral, my father called Marcus and me into his study. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes were as calculating as ever. "We need to discuss the estate," he said without preamble. "I've asked Jim Harrison to join us tomorrow to go over the details." I nodded, my expression carefully neutral. "That sounds appropriate." My father's gaze lingered on me. "I know this is a difficult time, but I want to be transparent about my decisions. Some of them may be surprising." "I'm sure you've done what you think is best," I replied, a bitter edge creeping into my voice despite my efforts. He frowned slightly. "This isn't about favorites, Olivia. It's about responsibility. The Coleman legacy, can we not do this now?" Marcus interrupted, his own grief evident. "We just buried Mom." My father straightened. "Of course. Tomorrow then. Jim will be here at 10. That night, I called Diane and told her everything: the safe deposit box, my mother's secondary trust, the recordings. She was silent for a long moment after I finished. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," she finally said. "And she's given you a powerful position. How do you want to play this?" I thought about all the years I'd spent seeking my father's approval, all the times I'd diminished my own achievements because they didn't align with his values. I thought about my mother's quiet strength, how she'd protected me even as she was dying. "I want justice," I said. "Not revenge, but justice. For me and for Mom." The next morning, Jim Harrison arrived precisely at 10. He was my father's age, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, the perfect picture of a trusted family attorney. We gathered in the living room, the formal space reserved for important occasions. My father began with a prepared speech about difficult decisions and family legacy. Jim nodded along, occasionally glancing at me with what I now recognized as pity. Marcus looked increasingly uncomfortable. When my father finished, Jim cleared his throat and began explaining the revised trust terms. As expected, the bulk of the estate would go to Marcus, with provisions for his children's education. My portion had been reduced to a nominal amount, enough, as my father put it, to supplement your museum salary. "Are there any questions?" Jim asked when he finished. "Just one," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Can you confirm when these revisions were made?" Jim glanced at my father, who nodded slightly. "The amendments were executed approximately 8 weeks ago. After Mom's diagnosis," I clarified. "Yes," Jim admitted. "Your father had power of attorney at that point." I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. "I'd like to submit these documents for consideration." Jim looked surprised but accepted the folder. As he began reviewing the contents, my father's expression changed from confusion to shock. "What is this?" he demanded. I met his gaze directly. "Mom's separate trust. The one you didn't know about." The color drained from my father's face. "That's not possible. Caroline didn't have separate assets. Her grandmother's investments," I explained. "She managed them independently for decades." Jim was studying the documents with growing concern. "Richard, this appears to be a legitimate trust, established 5 years ago. And these recorded conversations," my father's hands clenched into fists. "This is absurd. Caroline would never go behind my back like this." "She did," I said simply. "Because she knew exactly what you would do. She knew you would punish me for not being Marcus." Marcus was staring at the floor, clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding confrontation. "Jim," I continued, "I've retained separate counsel who is prepared to challenge the revision to the original family trust. We have evidence that the changes were made using power of attorney in direct contradiction to my mother's wishes and my father's own stated intentions." I nodded toward the USB drive. Jim removed his glasses, suddenly looking every bit his age. "Richard, if these recordings are authenticated, the revision would be difficult to defend. This is how you honor your mother's memory," my father snapped at me. By threatening litigation days after her funeral? I'm honoring her wishes, I corrected. Something you deliberately chose not to do. The room fell silent. Marcus finally looked up, his expression torn between loyalty to our father and shock at what had been revealed. What do you want? My father finally asked, his voice tight. The original trust terms restored, I said. Equal shares, as you and Mom always intended. As you explicitly agreed to in those recordings. My father turned to Jim. Give us the room. After Jim left, my father paced the living room, occasionally stopping to stare out the window at the gardens my mother had loved. You don't understand what's at stake, he finally said. The business needs capital to expand. Marcus has been working on acquisitions that could double our market share. Then use your own money, I replied. Not my inheritance. It's all the same pool, he insisted. Family money should support family business. I shook my head. That's your value, not mine. And not Mom's either, apparently. Marcus finally spoke up. Dad, Liv's right. If you and Mom agreed to equal shares, that's what should happen. My father's head snapped toward him. You're taking her side? After everything I've built for you? I'm not taking sides, Marcus said quietly. I'm saying we need to respect Mom's wishes. Something in my father seemed to deflate then. The calculating businessman gave way to an aging widower who had just lost his wife of 40 years. She really set up a separate trust, he asked, his voice suddenly uncertain. I nodded. And she recorded our conversations? She knew she might need proof. My father sank into an armchair, looking genuinely bewildered. I never thought she would. I didn't think she was capable of such foresight. You underestimated her, I said. Just like you've always underestimated me. 3 days later, the original trust terms were restored. My father signed the documents with a grim resignation, barely meeting my eyes. Marcus expressed quiet support, though I could tell he was still processing the entire situation. As I packed to return to my apartment in the city, my father appeared in the doorway of my childhood bedroom. Your mother would be proud of you, he said stiffly. Standing up for yourself. I folded a sweater carefully before responding. She was always proud of me. She just didn't make her love conditional on me becoming a carbon copy of her. He flinched but didn't argue the point. I always wanted what was best for you. No, I corrected him. You wanted what you thought was best for the Coleman name. There's a difference. He stood there for a long moment, this man who had loomed so large throughout my life. For the first time, I saw him clearly, not as the infallible patriarch, but as a flawed human being who had confused control with love. I don't expect you to forgive me, he finally said. Good, because I'm not ready to offer forgiveness, I replied honestly. But I am grateful for one thing. What's that? Mom showed me that quiet strength can be just as powerful as obvious authority. That lesson alone is worth more than any inheritance. As I drove away from my childhood home that afternoon, the weight of betrayal still sat heavy in my chest. But alongside it was something new, a profound appreciation for my mother's foresight and courage, and a growing confidence in my own ability to stand firm. Had always thought that blood meant something. That family was the one constant in a world full of variables. Now I understood that family bonds, like any relationship, require integrity to remain intact. My father had broken that trust, and while it could potentially be repaired someday, it would never be the same. But in losing one version of family, I had discovered another, one based not on blind obligation but on genuine respect. My mother's final gift wasn't just financial security, it was the permission to define family on my own terms. The inheritance I truly valued wasn't measured in dollars, it was my mother's quiet strength, now residing in me, the END.